This podcast is brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling for those who make and drink great spirits. Join our free email newsletter for technical and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Learn more at spiritsandistilling.com.
Hey guys, welcome to episode number 5 of the Craft Spirits and Distilling podcast. My name is Sydney. I'm with you guys today, and we are going to talk to my current boss, Riley Henderson of Few Spirits. He is the director of operations for Few, and we're going to get into some of the more esoteric products that Few has been producing over the past few years that might not be known to everyone, but some really fun fermentation things, utilizing koji, which is kind of Riley's specialty, which he developed. So I'm really excited to get into this conversation. But before we jump in, craft the perfect blend every time by enhancing the flavor profile of your spirits with Technoblend's state-of-the-art blending and batching technology. Technoblend is the trusted partner of distilleries across the country, providing solutions for unparalleled accuracy and consistency in the distilled spirits production process. Visit technoblend.com today to discover how their innovative solutions can redefine the art of distillation. Technoblend, blend the best. Is your brewery, distillery, or heck, I'll say it, brewstillery looking for better control of production, finance, compliance, inventory, supply chain, etc.? You want a system that untaps your potential and future-proofs your strategy. You need total visibility into every aspect of your business, and you need it on demand. Visit craftederp.com to learn how Crafted meets you where you are today and prepares you for everything that's coming tomorrow. craftederp.com. Hi, Riley.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, very excited to talk to you today. So I've been working with you for 3 years now, which feels really wild to say.
It does. I think I asked you the other day, like, how long have you been here? Like 6 years?
It feels like 10. And also 10 minutes at the same time. Yeah. But you have been with Few for a very, very long time. So can you tell me a little bit how you came into Few and your rise through the Few ranks and just a little bit of your background for our listeners?
Sure. Yeah. My background's actually primarily in the arts, visual arts. Went to college for photography, of all things. Ended up working for Playboy for a couple of years outside of school, which is also very strange. And just as we're talking, I'm noticing a big water leak on the ceiling. Operations issues. After Playboy, I ended up, I was kind of simultaneously doing my own art practice for a long time and doing some kind of sculptural work, and ended up finding my way into woodworking. Once I left Playboy, I started building custom furniture and working for a 60-year-old cigar lounge in Chicago. So working there for about 5 years. And after that amount of time, I kind of realized I wanted to try something new. And I wanted to be a maker, right? So I wanted to get out of the shop aspect and back into production. So knew I was interested in whiskey, but didn't really know where to go with it. I didn't really know that distilling was an option. Luckily, there were some great kind of industry professionals that hung out at Up Down, which is the cigar shop. And one of them included Paul Holetko, our founder and leader.
A great and glorious leader.
So I got to talking with him and some now friends, Monique Houston and Martin Duffy, who were all patrons of the shop. And we just started talking a lot of whiskey, and eventually, I think at the time I was interested in opening maybe like a cigar whiskey lounge, trying to figure that out. I'm very happy I didn't, because that would have been miserable. I didn't know enough about it and had never worked in a bar. And so I ended up reaching out to about 6 different breweries, distilleries, just kind of anything to get my foot in the door, seeing as I had no experience. And Paul and our at-time operations head, Stephen Kaplan, weren't looking for anybody at the time, but they reached back out in September and gave me a shot. So I came in on as an assistant distiller, did that for a couple of years, got moved up to head distiller when our current head distiller left for, who did they leave for? another craft distillery on the East Coast, but I think they're working for Bullet now. So they had kind of hopped around for a bit. It might have been Wild Turkey, actually. Head distiller for a couple of years, and then been head of operations since. So took on that head of operations role mid-COVID, which is daunting to say the least.
Yeah. Riley does a lot of things that I don't even fully comprehend. I am currently the head distiller of Few, so my job every day is to execute our production to the best of my ability and keep it consistent. But Riley looks at, would you say, like, more bigger picture things? Can you, like, from an operations standpoint, how does that differ from just distilling? Because I think a lot of people who consider our jobs and what we do, they look at it through almost a rose-colored lens and like, well, you're just distilling every day. You're making whiskey every day. But there's so much more that goes into it as of like running any business.
Yeah, for sure. I think, the way I look at our setup is Few is kind of split into two categories, right? Production and processing. Sydney, you've been a part of kind of running everything too in the COVID times, right? Like we need distillers that can bottle, we need bottlers that can distill. So everybody's cross-trained to some degree. But really, I think my goal is to try to look 6 months to 5 years in advance and try to keep things on track, try to keep people happy, employed. Again, make sure things are consistent, products are happening on time, quality's up to snuff. I think the distilling side's a little unique because if that really is all you're doing, you're kind of focusing in on a product that then you've got some buffer before it hits market, right? Whereas the processing side is a little more daunting because you're the last line of defense before you hit the market. So if something's wrong, it kind of falls on the shoulders of the processing folks. Sorry, you're going to say something.
And when you say processing, for those who are listening, you mean like bottling from our side?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm thinking, at least for Few, production is going to be receipt of grain, mashing in, fermentation, distillation to barreling, and some warehousing aspects. And then processing is, the second half of that warehousing, storage kind of process, and then blending, filtering, bottling, blending, packaging, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, all the important things that it takes to get things to market. And I always tell people that bottling in particular is such an unsung, like, hero work in the distilling world. People don't realize how much work goes into bottling and running a successful bottling line and staying consistent. But that's a big focus that you and our colleague Skylar work on. And you guys pump through a lot of booze when we're fully up and running. Can you talk about our bottling line a little bit? Because it's one of the more automatic lines that I've worked on. And it was definitely a very different experience for me going from a line that was very manual, that I was running in Florida, to Few's bottling line, which is a lot of moving parts, literally.
A lot of moving parts, and it's very Frankenstein. Mm-hmm. If you look through some of the electrical panels, like it's an Italian machine, but there are French notes in it. I think it's our filler and our rinser have been old wine fillers in the past. And so we had to have a lot of our components custom made for our square bottles, which I think would have been the case for most fillers, especially at the time that we brought these machines on, because we didn't have the funds to kind of build something from the floor up. So we primarily work with Guy, and I want to say it's we need to get Skylar on for more deets on the filler, but I think it's a 6-head filler, rotary style. We've got kind of a U-shape bend that comes around. So traditionally we've had I guess at least since like maybe 2018, we've had a labeler that does fronts and backs. But if you've ever seen the Few bottle, you know that there's front, back, shoulder strap, which folds kind of over the corner, and then the tamper strip. So traditionally we'd automated the fronts, backs, and hand applied the shoulders and the tamper, which requires 2 dedicated people. So that's 2 people that aren't focusing on, pack out or monitoring quality on those fills. So a couple of years ago, we went to Tronics, which is based out of Australia, I think, but they have a hub in Indiana. So the idea of having a machine that was built by people just, an hour or two away was really great. It's been a learning curve with this machine because it's not the, it's high quality, but it's not top of the line. So there's a lot of kind of manual adjustments that need to be made. But it's still light years ahead of what we were doing before. And it was able to take 2 people off the line and kind of reshuffle that. So, going from doing maybe 300, 4.5 liter cases in a day to 700. So still a lot of manual labor, even with that automated machine. As you know, Sid, it's, pack out and pack in are the kind of hardest physically.
Yeah.
That's just a lot of weight to be moving around.
When I first started at Few, it was slightly more manual, and I was one of the people that put either the side strap on or what we call the top strap, which is very similar to like the tax stamp that used to go over bottles. And if anyone has seen the episode of like I Love Lucy, where she's trying to package chocolate and it gets very overwhelming and chocolate's everywhere and she's like shoving it down her throat. That's sometimes what bottling felt like. Bottles would pile up and you'd be trying to get these stickers on really quickly, and it can be very stressful and very intense. So there's something to definitely be set for automated bottling lines, but they're still extraordinarily finicky. I know we have worked quite a bit to get that as seamlessly flowing as it is currently right now.
Yeah. And the minute you hit a good flow and you're like really cruising and you're hitting those bottles as they're coming off, like something goes off. Like the labels start kicking 2 milliliters too far to 2 millimeters like to the left, right? So you kind of have to shut everything down and recalibrate. And then it's lunchtime and everybody comes back from lunch groggy and not wanting to you're not able to put in as much effort, right? Like it's a constant balance of like human effort and a well-functioning machine.
My favorite thing is whenever we would get 2 different manufacturers of glass that would come through the line, and maybe one bottle would be like a millimeter off spec, and it would just clog up the whole line and it wouldn't run through the rotary system correctly and bottles would start breaking. And it's just chaos. And I think it's one of the reasons why when you go on these big like Kentucky tours that the bottling line isn't really shown, because it's not like the sexy, fun, cute, artisanal part of production, but it is one of the most crucial,
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody wants to be a distiller. Nobody wants to bottle. Mm-hmm. But I think if you really want to hone your quality control, your senses, I think being on the other end of the spectrum is really important, whether it's full-time or part-time. It's kind of like, I feel like everybody should work in a restaurant at least once in their life, right? Just to better understand what goes into the production of their food. Like I kind of feel the same way with spirits. Like if you're going to be a distiller, like you need to work a bottling line and you need to kind of experience that element of our industry.
Yeah. It's funny too, working a bottling line. I've worked 3 different lines now in my career, all that have varying levels of involvement. The first was extraordinarily manual. We were hand labeling. We were hand writing out the labels. We were filling on like a 4 group head filler, but it was very, very hands-on. And we were maybe doing like 100 cases in a day. Transitioning down to Florida, which was slightly more automated. We had an automatic label machine. We had an automatic filler, but we were still writing some parts of the label out, and we were still hand applying that top sticker to the cork and shrink wrapping with a heat gun each and every bottle that came off the line to the line that we work now. And I will say the attention it's given me to packaging is just so funny and also obnoxious. I go into a liquor store and I look at bottles and I'm like, man, the cost of the packaging on that must be absolutely insane. And it's kind of taken the enjoyment out of browsing bottles on a liquor store shelf, because I keep on thinking, man, I wonder what kind of equipment they have to work with that custom glass mold, or I wonder how difficult it is for them to get glass in, or I wonder how many cases they can put out a day with that kind of shape. Would you say that you do the same thing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was the same with furniture building. When I was doing that, it's like I can't sit at a table without kind of like running my hand under the table to just like see how it comes together. Like, what's the joinery look like? How is it made? So I definitely kind of look at other bottles and think about the costs and human cost of what went into that as well. Because I think it's just, unless you have all the money in the world, it's just kind of a trade-off, like completely hand filled, hand applied, low output, or automated, high power output with something a little more standardized. So I think we've had to come up with some interesting ways to try to up our label game without kind of changing the formula too much.
Yeah. And we've done a lot of really cool labels in the past few years that I've just been here alone. Our standard label are very reminiscent of the Chicago World Fair, but I think the fun part of packaging for me when I'm considering it is bottle shape. And then also the label itself. Like, there's so much beautiful art that goes into label, and you coming from an artistic background, what do you kind of gravitate towards when you're considering like label art and putting new products on the market and looking at it from like an aesthetic point of view?
I've actually learned, because I wouldn't say that like you'd think that my art background would maybe give me a little more insight into that. And like, I do have I feel like a good sense of composition, but I think my personal style is much different than Fuse style. I've had to learn a lot from our marketing team and from our developers, because I tend to want to put more about strictly what's about the whiskey, what's in it. Coming from a production standpoint, like I want to be almost too literal with it, whereas we rely a lot on our marketing team to do a little more of the storytelling and to help us to kind of come up with these ideas. So I think honestly, Serial Killer, our straight rye koji whiskey, was one of the first labels that I really kind of input, not into the direct imagery, but to the ideology behind it, thinking about the World's Fair as being also the Festival of Light, trying to think about the World's Fair in a way that wasn't just like taking an icon from it and placing it on a label, but trying to think about more of what the idea behind the fair was, or what it at least came to be, and how that relates to the idea of koji and fermentation. Thinking about it as two ends of a scale, dark and light. This label ended up, obviously with a name like Serial Killer, it was pretty dark and kind of film noir, I'd say, but also kind of representing some of those ideas that I wanted to put into it as well.
Yeah. If you are listening to this episode and you're curious as to this label that we're talking about, if you go online and you Google Few Serial Killer, cereal being spelled like cereal grain, it's this gorgeous label that has a man in a top hat, his like silhouette, and he's holding a big scythe, like the Grim Reaper. And it's one of the cooler labels that I think that we've put out in the past few years. And we'll talk a little bit more about the liquid inside of that bottle. But you were very instrumental in kind of working on this label, as well as the rice whiskey that we just put out as well. That's a collaboration we've done with some restaurants around town. And you want to talk a little bit about the rice whiskey label?
Sure. So, that was my first time working with a collaborator, in this case being Sushi-san. And it was interesting trying to kind of find a middle ground between Fuse style, their style, and something that kind of represented both parties. So I always want things to happen immediately, right? Like we got an idea, let's get it done. Let's move on to the next thing. Because there's always a list a mile long. So it took longer than I would have liked, but I think we reached something that was pretty nice for both parties. So Sushi-san has this wonderful kind of internal story of the lucky cat that they had around during COVID. And one of their sushi chefs, somebody at the bar accidentally sold the lucky cat.
No.
Yeah. And so the next day, this chef and part owner came in and he was like, what happened to it? Where did it go? And they're like, oh, somebody wanted it. So we sold it to him. We figured we had a bunch in box upstairs, like not a big deal. And he's like, that's your luck. You just sold away our good luck. You got rid of it. Don't ever do that. God. You can give them the new ones.
Yeah.
The ones we have established here are ours. So the iconography on the label is kind of that cat forefront in front of the Phoenix Garden, which is a garden in Jackson Park here in Chicago, just north of the replica of the Statue of the Republic, which you'll see on our bourbon labels. So it's this beautiful Japanese garden that was a gift from Osaka during the World's Fair. Fell into a bit of disrepair after that, especially during the war. And then after that, the city decided to kind of put some more funds into reestablishing it and expanding it. So you've got the background of the Phoenix Garden, and then you've got the Lucky Cat in the front. Nice, simple design for a simple but elegant whiskey. So that particular whiskey doesn't have any koji, but it's 100% rice whiskey. So yeah, really nice, delicate whiskey aged in new oak barrels, 4 years. Really wonderful.
We'll talk a little bit about this rice whiskey, which this is the first time that I had ever worked with rice, but the rice whiskey itself kind of made in like a bourbon sort of style. Would you say that in terms of the new oak and how we distilled it? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, a little different in the sense that, there's no koji enzymes, there's no barley enzymes. This is strictly 100% rice with exogenous enzymes. So, that was because we wanted to kind of see what that rice could bring to the table on its own, without kind of adding any additional flavors, trying to keep that as singular as possible, just to kind of see what it did. And it turned out really wonderful.
Before we dig more into that and also talk about the serial killer rye whiskey, which incorporates rice as well, we're going to talk a little bit about Country Malt Group. They're proud to support craft distillers across North America with a carefully curated portfolio of the best everyday ingredients and supplies, including malt, adjuncts, fruit, yeast, and more. Visit countrymalt.com/distilling to view their complete list of distilling products, resources, and podcast episodes. Say goodbye to the complexities of ordering equipment and supplies from multiple vendors and say hello to the efficiency and simplicity offered by Lotus Beverage Alliance. This new alliance brings together craft beverage industry powerhouses GW Kent, Alpha Brewing Operations, Stout Tanks and Kettles, Twin Monkeys Beverage Solutions, Brewmation, and Automated Extractions to provide an unrivaled portfolio of craft beverage equipment and supplies. Experience the convenience of working with one vendor, one source for all of your craft beverage and business needs. Visit lotusbevalliance.com now and start streamlining your process today. So I will say, before we start talking a little bit more about the rice whiskey, we made this not too long ago at Few, and it was my first time working with rice. I will say, working with ground rice, milled rice, not my favorite thing. Very fine. So fine. I would compare the rice flour that we got in to glitter in crafting. We got it in, it went everywhere, and it has never left. It's like I look over at the floor and I see like a white outline. I'm like, that's frickin' rice. And it's still there. It was so frustrating to work with it because it just kind of, it's so fine. It just goes into the air and it gets all over everything. And mashing it was a very different experience. We had some clogging issues with it, but the distillate was unlike anything I've ever had before. And I honestly don't really have a frame of reference in describing the rice whiskey. It was so unique and so different. And the way that we distilled it was such an interesting thing because we made it kind of in the exact same way we produce all of our other whiskeys. We stripped it off of our beer still, which is a Vindom column, and we finished it in our Coda hybrid pot. And it was one of the cooler projects that I've worked on, but Lord knows it put me through the ringer just from a production operations standpoint of getting the rice to actually cooperate in the mash tun and getting it to run off the still. But the flavors were really outstanding.
Yeah, I think even after you guys did a heavy caustic rinse on our strip, there was still a bit of residue left over. I mean, it gums up really easy.
Yeah.
Different than rye though. I mean, I feel like there's some similarities in the way that it mashed in, but at least the way and it's been a few years since I've personally mashed it in, but I don't remember it being as dough barley as rye grain. But I know you guys had a different experience this year that we had to deal with together. But
I would say that, so we also did a 100% rye whiskey this past year, and we had some stickiness with that as well. And doing these grains that have some issues with liquefaction, oftentimes you can add like a beta glucanase into your mashing protocol, and that can help with pumpability and liquefying it. So we did that for the rye whiskey, the 100% rye. And I know we did that for the rice whiskey as well. And it did help. But yeah, that rice, it gummy is the perfect word. Like a melted in the sun gummy bear is how I would describe it. But the flavors were really cool. What do you get when you tasted that rice whiskey?
So I think for me, I remember the very first time we mashed it in, and I distinctly remember the aroma of just those puffed rice cakes. I don't know if you call them anything else other than rice cakes, but the kind of cylindrical cakes. It was very fresh. It was very light, and it had a delicate, like light fruitiness as well. And it was aging well for a number of years, but nothing too kind of wild coming out. Still like maybe a little unbalanced, but then we're also concerned that too much time in new oak would potentially wash out any of those delicate flavors. But I'm glad this opportunity to do a collaboration kind of came along because, we harvested it, I want to say just after 4 years, and it had this really creamy, delicate, fruity. I mean, I was trying to come up with descriptors with you one day, and I think we came up to like strawberry cream savers.
Yeah.
Or was that just me? Did I make that up?
No, I can definitely see that. It had this almost like kind of melon ball flavor for me as well. But unlike any frame of reference that I had with, standard bourbon and standard rye, I know what those grains taste like. They're very familiar to me. They're easy for me to pick out, but the rice was so completely different. And I've always associated it with sake and soju and things like that. And I know that has been a big source of inspiration for you with that rice whiskey project. And then also with the serial killer, which is the koji rye whiskey that we've done.
Yeah. I think when Sushi-san came to us and wanted to collaborate, my first thought was like, okay, well, maybe we do like a whiskey infusion or a gin or something that kind of utilizes elements from their omakase room, or, I tend to go like big over-engineered picture first and then realize that that's too much and then work myself back to like 0.1. So after a while I realized, I was like, well, we have this rice whiskey, and like rice is kind of the unsung hero of sushi, right? I mean, it's the carrier for everything. And if your rice is off texturally, flavor-wise, then the whole meal's off. So I think it's really beautiful to have something that not only represents that simplicity, but also creates this beautiful kind of vessel for cocktails and just food pairings and things like that. Because it is a really gentle whiskey that I think would pair well with like a subtler food for sure.
And I know a lot of your inspiration comes from food and fermentation experiments that you do at home. I affectionately call you the mush man because you love mushrooms and foraging and things of that nature. But talk a little bit about your fermentation experiments and how that kind of led to the serial killer development, because I think that is one of the most special, if not one of the coolest rye whiskeys I've ever heard of. Not just few related, but just anywhere in the world.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's a really special project for us. The distillery is an extension of the kitchen for me. So I love to cook. And in my mind, it's kind of the same process, right? You're working with these components to make something completely different, right? Like bread doesn't taste like flour and water. You know what I mean? Like you're taking these components and you're transforming them into something intentional and sometimes whimsical, like it can change. There's a certain magic to it, even though it's all chemistry. So for me, working with experiments at home, I had been kind of trying to isolate wild yeast strains for a while when I had just started at FIO. And so that was kind of my entry into alternative fermentation, trying to isolate these strains, figure out what fermented something delicious, what fermented something with a relatively decent yield, what could I bake bread with, like all these different things, and trying to learn about cataloging and saving yeast strains. And then one day, Paul, Stephen, and I were kind of sitting around, and Paul's like, what if we did a koji bourbon? And I had just been reading through Art of Fermentation by Sandor Katz. And it's just this wonderful, wonderful text with fermentation processes from all over the world with instructions on how to do them as well. Just my favorite kind of reading, something that's cultural and technical. Like that's kind of what my brain can absorb the best. So I kind of first, when he brought it up, I was like, no, I don't think so. Because that was one of the chapters I kind of skipped over. Because I'm like, when am I going to find time to like grow mold on something? Where am I going to get that mold? Like, I don't know what it looks like, tastes like. I'm not comfortable with that. Because I think one of the things it said in the book was like, with fermentation, you really have to trust your sense of smell. Like if something smells off, it's probably off. But if you're not used to fermentation or fermented foods, then everything kind of smells off until you get acclimated to it. So for me, that was the biggest learning curve, is like learning to trust my senses and to trust what you make, but then to also know your like safety protocols, your parameters to kind of live within. Because something nasty can still be living in something that smells good. So, but him just saying it, I was like, I'm pretty sure with koji, again, I didn't know much at the time. I'm like, I'm pretty sure we'd have to like grow mold on everything. And then how are we milling the corn and yada, yada. I didn't think it was doable. And so I was like, no, I don't think so, Paul. I'm going to go make some malted rye. And we've got some malted rye that's still sitting in the warehouse. That is delicious, but yeah, I can't say that it's anything,
special.
Right. Yeah. It's nice. It's a good whiskey, but it's, there's nothing too different from it. And so, but whenever somebody tells me something or asks me something that I don't know, there's a switch in my head that goes off. I'm like, shoot, I really need to know that.
It just
even if they're never going to come back with that question, I'm like, I don't want somebody else to come to me with that question and then not know what it is.
It just grows in your brain.
Yeah. So you got to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah. Like a koji spore.
Like a koji spore, just floating in the wind.
Yeah. For those who might not know what koji is, because we've been talking about it a little bit now. Koji is it's a mold. It's a fungus, right?
Yeah. So koji can kind of be used to in a couple ways. So koji can be used to refer to the byproduct of growing mold on some kind of substrate. So it tends to be a particular mold, Aspergillus oryzae. Although there are a number of other kind of strains and varietals that are used as well, but that's going to be your most prominent one. And so you can also grow it on proteins. So you'll see a lot of like Western cooks and chefs, people, restaurants like Noma that have kind of adapted these processes to create non-traditional kind of food products. So the traditional food products you'd see made from koji would be soy sauce, sake, different kind of sauces, and essentially what would kind of come out to like amino paste or amino sauces. So soy sauce and miso are kind of the most prominent ones on the food side. Sake, shochu, probably the most prominent ones, at least to Americans on the saccharification side. So koji can also be used to refer to just the mold spore. So it's kind of multi-use there. Mm-hmm.
So Paul planted this koji spore in your brain.
He
planted the spore. Hashtag The Last of Us. I don't even know if we can say that on this podcast without having to go through HBO, but there it is. So from there, you decided, well, hey, why don't we try?
Right. As I started learning more about it, my focus has started to shift from yeast to koji, which I think a lot of people get confused sometimes. If they know a little bit about koji, they think it does the entire fermentation, right? They think it's yeast. They think it's enzyme. Certain kind of cultural products like chu, spelled Q-U, is like a Chinese kind of pitch, essentially. So it's a ball of koji mold, grain. There is yeast in there as well. So that is kind of like an all-purpose pitch. But for our purposes, koji is just going to be the saccharification element. Essentially what we're doing is we're growing our koji on rice. Depending on what you want to produce, you can incubate that rice once it's inoculated with mold on the lower end of the spectrum, like 80 Fahrenheit, and you get more protease enzymes. So if you're making a miso or a soy sauce, you're going to want to hold that incubation temp at a lower range. If you're making something that requires different amylase enzymes, you're going to want to hold it closer to the higher end of the spectrum, being 90 to 100 Fahrenheit. And you're going to need to maintain about 90% humidity for the extent of this fermentation. One of the big differences with this fermentation compared to our kind of liquid is it's a solid state fermentation. So essentially you want the grain moist, but you don't want it soaking because this mold needs solid substrate. It needs oxygen moving through. So essentially you're creating a bed of sushi rice almost, right? Instead of like a rice porridge. So it's a very delicate balance on how you cook it, how you incubate it. The incubation time is approximately 2 to 3 days. You have this kind of initial takeoff once you inoculate the rice or your substrate. So the first 18 to 24 hours, you're going to need to keep that temperature up. But after that point, the metabolism really takes hold. And then for the remainder of the fermentation time, you're going to need to try to keep that temperature down because it will easily kill itself. If your beds of rice are too thick, there's too much core on it, or you just kind of lose track of it. The minute it kills off that mold, Bacillus subtilis is going to move in. You start getting a lot of diacetyl, like popcorn notes, other funky things can move in. So, just like a liquid fermentation, you want to really kind of fortify it. That first 24 hours is really important so that your primary microorganism is taking hold. So after that time, what we'll do is we'll harvest this rice from the trays. And I guess I can explain what our room kind of looks like in a minute. But we'll take this back to the distillery and pitch it almost as we would malted barley. So primary difference is that with malted barley and exogenous enzymes, your temperature thresholds are a little higher. So on fungally derived enzymes, at least in my research, I found those enzymes tend to have a much lower threshold. So we're pitching yeast and koji at about the same time so that we can also kind of achieve a simultaneous saccharification fermentation process. Not to overwhelm the yeast, but also to kind of create this more dynamic fermentation. So we're pitching closer to 100, 120 Fahrenheit, as opposed to obviously like the average pitch of 150 for malted barley.
Yeah. And then, so we at Few have built this whole contraption for growing this spore in the form of a room. And actually, before Riley and I sat down for this conversation, we were working on installing new equipment in this room. So it's kind of a labor of love, I would say, that has continued to evolve over the years. So talk a little bit about all of the infrastructure that you had to develop to grow koji, because it's a very delicate process. You can't just grow it wherever.
It is, and there have been a ton of iterations. So I think the first koji experiment we did was maybe 2017. And needless to say, there was a lot I didn't understand at the time and our team didn't understand. And so, a lot of happy accidents that led to a really beautiful whiskey, but a very unreproducible whiskey, because if you've ever done something that's so outside your realm of comprehension for the first time, there's a ton you learn just by doing it. At least I think for myself and for the team here, like we learn a lot by doing and by, nobody here is a scientist by trade. So we're very sensory focused. So this first release, I guess I should say the mash bill, it tends to be what we've kind of locked in is a 70-20-10 mash bill, which is more or less what we do for core bourbon and rye, except we're doing 70% rye, 20% wheat, 10% koji rice. Those add up?
Yeah.
100, 200?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Math.
So over time, what I've been trying to do is grow that amount of koji. Because 10% is, if you think about what you'd need for a whiskey mash bill that's just using malted barley as your conversion, 10% is going to be low for that. It's going to be low for these mashes as well. So if you think about koji, it's kind of akin to green malt, because you're not kilning it. So even on a very low spectrum kilning, you're denaturing a lot of different enzymes that exist in that malted barley, because they have protease enzymes too. They need to break down those cell walls, amongst a lot of others. So with koji, you're not only getting, even if you hold it high into the spectrum, you're getting amylase enzymes, you're getting plenty of protease enzymes, lipase enzymes. And so for our experiments, we want to try to keep all of those as whole as possible for the process, just to give the yeast as diverse a plate of food as possible, just to kind of see what they do. So that first year, we figured, hey, well, how the hell are we going to keep this much grain in that temperature and humidity range? And I was like, oh, our boiler room is kind of, it's kind of in that spectrum. And so I built
Every time you mention growing mold in the boiler room, our boiler room at View is in a basement under the distillery. I say it's where the demons live. And it just cracks me up every single time. It's like, envision Frankenstein's laboratory, if you will. It is scary. It is dimly lit. There are weird sounds down there. And just imagining Riley hunched over.
And there's sweaty Riley just like scuttling about in the basement. Get out.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what you picture is exactly what happened. We built this special table and tried to maintain it. At the time, I was concerned about running, more or less whole grains through our system as well, because our column still inlet is only like a 3/4 inch inlet. So we've had issues in the past where if whole grains make it through on our grinds, then, the system clogs really easily. So I'm like, oh, well, if we're putting 10% whole grains in these things, like that could mess us up. So also you have to cook the grain ahead of time before you inoculate it. So I think we tried using rolled rice at the time. I can't remember if that's the right phrase or not. But essentially, heated rolled rice. And the big learning curve there was, okay, well, the rice actually needs to be whole so that you can allow it when it's pre-gelatinized like that and kind of flattened out, like it just turns to a mush more or less. So we didn't get nearly as much oxygen to the table. There was definitely conversion, but there was much more bacterial influence than I think was intended. So essentially, we've got these open grates that go from our boiler room to up below our mash deck. And it smelled like the most beautiful, like forest floor mushroom, but also there was like clearly like some butterscotchy kind of character to it as well, which was probably the biggest, clearest sign that we had something else kind of going to town on it. Mm-hmm. So super interesting fermentation, super interesting output, dismal yields. I mean, that just, we achieved maybe 50 finished cases once this was all said and done. So on a, I think it was a 30 barrel cook. So pretty atrocious yields. So after that, I kind of had to work my way back to figure out what was successful about it, what worked, what didn't, how can we make it more efficient? So year 2, I set up an 8x8 tent on the main floor, built 3 trays. We were able to do 150 pounds of koji that year. And I wanted to make up for the yield. So it's like, let's really saturate it this year. Like, I think we can handle more grain. And then the fermentations, like, I think that the koji was spot on. We actually got spores from Hitachino in Japan. They were on a tour the year before of the States and visiting different distilleries. And I wasn't there the day they came through, but Paul gave them some of the new make, and they're like, "Oh, this is beautiful. Like, what are you doing? You should use some of our koji." So they sent us some spores that I tried to step up, and which I probably wouldn't do again. Stepping up, so you can like prop yeast, right? Like propping mold is a different beast that I don't know I would try again. So, but I think it was successful in this go around. But that oversaturation, even with defoamer, ended up overflowing our fermenters, and they got hugely infected with some kind of butyric bacteria, producing bacteria. And I barreled it anyways, just to see if butyric ages out, and I will tell you that it does not.
No,
you get heavy butyric, redistill it, use it for something else.
It's pungent.
It does not age out,
no.
And you can't use those barrels. So
butyric is this off note that is affectionately called the baby vomit off note. That's kind of the smell, the flavor that you get. It's very uncomfortable to experience.
It can be kind of cheesy, tropical. After that happened, I was like, how can we control it to just get a little butyric? Because I like a little butyric. Like a touch of it is like beautiful,
just a
like
little vomit.
pineapple. There's a very low sensory threshold for this stuff. So you don't need much of it to really just kind of blast your senses. So a touch of it leads to like really beautiful tropical pineapple and papaya, but then quickly starts to be like overripe papaya. And then you start to go baby vomit and cheese. And it's very uncontrollable. So I'd rather just stay away from it. But one of these days I'll figure out how to work with it.
Godspeed.
So year 2 was a failure, which was really frustrating because we put a lot of work into that. Year 3, I think, was COVID. 18, 19. When did COVID first hit?
2020.
So yeah, I think 2019, I got the go ahead to like invest in actually building a koji room. So at one of our warehouses, there's kind of a little room in the back that nobody uses. So I'm like, I'm going to call dibs on that. And ended up building this 8-foot by 12-foot room, where half of the room is about 4-foot by 2-foot trays with perforated aluminum bases. And they're 2 shelves high. So essentially we can do about 300 pounds of koji at a time in that room, which is a pretty large amount. Takes a lot of work to do though. So, but then COVID hit and that kind of set us behind probably a year or 2. And then I think 2021, I started getting back into doing these production runs and utilizing this new room. And then I got Skylar and the rest of our processing team in on it as well, which is great because moving that much rice by yourself
it's hard.
It's very hard.
It's very hard. It's not dry, right? It's steamed. It's heavy.
Yeah, it's hot.
It's hot. Yeah. And I remember us transporting it on a box truck to get it from one warehouse to the distillery because you have to steam it before you can use it. And it's just like a lot of moving parts.
Which if you think about it, like cooking that rice is a whole task in itself, right? I mean, even a commercial rice cooker might only cook a few pounds at a time. You know, I mean, and we're trying to cook 300 pounds of rice, like, so that we can pitch a batch in a general, relatively same amount of time. So essentially it's taking me all day to steam this rice. We have a large steel cone that we were trying to use for a different project that never came to fruition. And tapping off of our direct inject steam line from our column still into this cone. And we have all of our soaked rice in nylon bags and we're steaming it. So, the stuff at the bottom gets really soggy and the stuff at the top is perfect. So, trying to tweak that out has been interesting. I have some new projects this year that I'm going to try to do better. And I think I can probably cook maybe 70 pounds at a time or at least 50 more consistently is the hope.
Yeah. And the koji room itself is built entirely out of cedar as well, which is pretty traditional for koji rooms over in Japan, correct?
Yes, it's a different kind of cedar. It's more akin to like what you're going to get from Home Depot and line your closet with. So traditional Japanese cedar, from my understanding, is quite a bit different, quite a bit more subtle, but still has some of those antibacterial, antimicrobial kind of aspects to it, which are good from kind of keeping your koji room clean and monoculture.
Yeah. I think my favorite thing, as someone who didn't really know what koji was and was given this project from a pure flavor standpoint, the flavor that the koji produced and the runs that I worked on were so citrus forward because they were producing so much of the citric acid during fermentation. And I compared it to, we have the new make right here too. I remember distilling this and thinking that it tasted like this beautiful grapefruit juice. Mm-hmm. And it was so fat. I'd never tasted anything quite like it coming off the still. And I think it's this really awesome example of how fermentation is, as I have said before, and I will say again, this unsung hero of flavor development. And this is a perfect case study for it.
Yeah, I think that's coming from a few different places, right? Because we use a particular yeast with this as well. I think initially we were kind of playing around with like, well, what if we do like a sake yeast too, just to kind of keep within that like kind of cultural realm. And then, but kind of like lagering temps have never really been our thing. We don't necessarily ferment hot, but we ferment on the, 75, 80 range. So I think some of the places where that citrus is coming from is the koji, but primarily the yeast actually. So we're utilizing a kveik yeast for these fermentations. So traditional kind of Norwegian farmhouse strain that tends to produce a very singular kind of citrus or like peachy tropical high note. But then the big benefactor of it is that it ferments really cleanly at high temps. So in order to kind of keep, we can't keep these fermenters blocked up for too long because we need to kind of get back to regular production, but we do practice extended fermentation times on these. So you get a good amount of citric acid or lactic acid production on those as well, because we're doing maybe 5, potentially 7-day ferments. I think one of the things that you were referencing, Sid, is on this last batch we did, it was actually a strain of koji from, I'm blanking on the islands now, but awamori is the general product type that it's used for. It's Aspergillus lutuensis, I think it's called. So it's a particular strain that is a heavy citric acid producer. So if you walked into the koji room at the time, like it's starting to convert the starches in the rice and to break down that rice. And so you're starting to get some of this sweet, floral, mushroomy character. But then if you actually taste it kind of like a lemon drop, right? Because there's so much citric acid on the surface. I think in order to get that citric acid through or to get it enough to kind of function as a bacterial inhibitor, because in a lot of our mashes, we're pitching citric acid to kind of pH adjust. I think we'd need to use a lot more. I think we'd need to probably go like 50%, but that's a lot of koji for what we're doing.
That is a lot of koji.
The problem is we don't really have a way to stabilize that koji, because we could do a bunch of batches, backlog it, and then pitch, but we'd need some kind of massive dehydrator. Although maybe I can dehydrate with this new system we were putting in this morning.
Yeah.
So heat control's a huge thing too, right? In that first 24 hours. So we've utilized kind of an outdoor infrared heater that's controlled by a thermostat. So it's essentially measuring the core temp of that rice. And once it drops below a certain temperature, it kicks on the heater. But the heater wasn't very effective at even heating. It did a fine job, but it wasn't. I want to make it more consistent. So essentially, I've been researching radiant flooring. And so we're going to like line the bottom of these trays with copper piping, like snaked copper piping, run it off a closed loop inline boiler, water heater. And that'll be triggered by, again, the core temp of that rice so that we can really keep it under control. And if it goes up, the heater kicks off, the fan turns on, starts to cool it down. So even with that, we need somebody in there twice a day over those 3 days, breaking up and turning that rice, because eventually it turns into just a solid mat, right? Like it kind of grows together into a large, almost looks like a chunky block of tofu or something,
like a
right?
brick,
or one big mushroom. So it's not necessarily detrimental if you were to leave it there in the tray, but by breaking it up and kind of keeping the grains as singular as possible, you get more airflow, which again should create higher yield, more consistent product because you're giving that mycelium more energy to kind of dig deep. I got off on a tangent there.
I think, it's a good kind of tie into what are your future plans for this project. And I know making it more efficient, growing your koji more efficiently, creating a healthier spore. Are you working on it in any other way, different mash bills, different barrels? I mean, really the opportunities with this are limitless, which it's really, really cool for me. Legally, it's still a rye whiskey.
Yeah. So what we released was a straight rye whiskey. I think we've got a number of koji production runs. So early on, we thought it was doing a lot better in second use oak, just because it really emphasized that fermentative quality, because there's so much fun shit going on in that fermentation. that we thought that was the way to go. But I did have a couple barrels set aside of new oak as well. So that's what we released. And at about 3.5 years, it turned, and the new oak was tasting like marmalade, citrus. It had some, I find that it has some interesting dill characteristics to it.
Yeah, definitely on the finish, because I'm just taking a sip of it right now. We have it in front of us.
But citrus on the nose for sure. And then beyond, like sitting behind the citrus is a little bit of like an herbaceous kind of dill quality. Which
I love. That dill note in rye whiskey is one of my most favorite things on the planet.
I can't say that I've had it a ton in other whiskeys.
I'm super sensitive to it. And I think it's because I love dill pickles and I eat them all the time. It's one of my favorite foods. I could go through a whole jar, but I'm very sensitive to it with rye whiskey in particular. And it's definitely prevalent on the finish, but it's preceded by this really gorgeous citrus note that I love. And I haven't really seen it in too many other rye whiskeys because we associate rye as being either like spice bombs or having this herbal quality to it. And for the rye that we make at Few, this stone fruit character that we oftentimes describe our rye with, this is a different beast entirely.
Yeah, and I think one of my favorite things about our core rye is that it's a game changer for people that think they don't like rye whiskey. Mm-hmm. And that's one of my favorite things is like they come by a booth or something if we're at a show, and or if they used to come by our tasting room and they say, no, I don't want to drink the rye. I don't like it. Like, please, just if you don't like it, I'm not going to be hurt. Just take a sip, try it. Curious what you think. I'd say 70% of the time people are like, oh, wow, it's smooth, it's rich, it's not overly aggressive, which I think in the past people have just had bad whiskey. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's that they don't like rye whiskey. I think they've just had whiskey that maybe isn't top tier. I kind of feel the same way with cooking, right? I mean, plenty of things that people don't like. In my mind, a lot of those instances are because they've had it in a way that wasn't suitable for them, or had it produced in a way that wasn't suitable for them. People that grow up with like boiled green beans or, like overcooked greens.
I knew you were going to say green
stuff.
Beans because green beans are the thing that put me off vegetables, and I finally ate them the last week and you were there to see it.
We had some good green beans.
They were good green beans.
Hey.
Hashtag sushi-san.
Half of my job as head of ops is getting Sydney to eat salads. Just get some vegetables in your life.
We're doing the best we can.
Yeah.
But I guess, is there plans maybe down the road to do a koji bourbon, which I think would be the first of its kind in the history of bourbon?
We might be working on something like that. I think one of the things we've been spending years now. So I think we've been doing this project for 5 or 6 years now. And part of the goal has been to find a standard, try to find out what we like about it, what we can lock in for this product. Because I mean, whiskey takes so much time, so much foresight. And the first two being kind of interesting failures almost, even though one was successful, it's like, I think a failure in the sense that it wasn't something that was reproducible. Success in the sense that we made something really beautiful and unique. But how do we make something that we can reproduce? How do we make something we can scale up? Because, Few's this mid-sized company where if we were just selling this out of the tasting room, I'd be probably more apt to just be throwing things at the wall and doing like a bunch of really tiny little ferments. But we have to divert a lot more resources to these experiments. And so it makes a lot more sense if you can make something in a size that, if it isn't accessible to the whole nation, to make something that's accessible to the Illinois market at least. So I think we finally reached a point where I feel good about the consistency of it. The next step is going to be to produce some kind of different whiskeys. I don't know if I want to talk about that one too much.
That's fair. Yeah. I just, in my mind, it seems so cool to do a new style of bourbon that no one has done before, because I mean, we have explored so many different things with bourbon now, alternative corn. We've explored different oak, and the industry.
Yeah.
And I think fermentation is kind of that last frontier of really exciting things that could happen with bourbon production. And also on that note, rye whiskey production, because I've said it before, I'll say it again. This is the coolest rye whiskey that I think is being made in the United States right now.
And that's the root of it too, is like the whole thought process behind this was, how do we, because we're in we're in a sphere right now where like the market is saturated with not just a lot of whiskey, but a lot of really good whiskey, and a lot of it coming from craft producers too. And so how do you compete with people that are experimenting with every end of the spectrum of grain, with barrel types? Where do you go from there? And for me, it was layering in different types of fermentation altogether. Because in my mind, you're not only developing different enzymes, you're creating a unique flavor of that rice that's going in. It doesn't taste like rice anymore. It tastes more like a mushroom, right? And you're layering in, you're developing a different microbiome in that solid state fermentation, because it's open air too. So that koji room is developing its own terroir, if you will, that we're then pitching at a very low temperature. And so theoretically kind of maintaining some of those bacterial elements in a positive way. So yeah, I guess we can talk about it. It doesn't, no, it is what it is. I'm always hesitant to talk about products that aren't out yet, right? But we're going to be working on a koji bourbon. And so I think we'll probably keep some things the same. We always want to have through lines through our experiments, things that tie us back to core products, to core few, because we can't just be an experimental company. We have to kind of tie things back to those things that make us who we are and, keep us viable. So plenty of experimentation to come. I'm sure we'll split barrels still. I think, were we to make a bourbon, we'd probably keep it new oak just to produce a product that's a little more accessible for people that might be afraid of something that is a DSS or, bourbon adjacent. Mm-hmm. So I think having a straight whiskey is an easier access point for the consumer to kind of maybe try something strange that they wouldn't have tried otherwise.
Yeah, for sure. It is a really exciting project, and I am so thankful that I've gotten to work on it. What I haven't shared super publicly other than my social media, if you follow me on Instagram or if we're friends on Facebook or whatever, you might have seen that I am actually going to be leaving Few in the next 2 weeks. So really this podcast that I'm doing with Riley right now is my exit interview that I'm sharing with everyone. I am going to be moving on to Heaven Hill. I'm going to be working for them in an operations position for a distillery that they're building. But I really wanted to talk to Riley today about this project because working on it has been one of the great honors of my career. And he is one of the greatest, I think, distilling minds in the craft industry right now. And
if it sounds like it's raining, it's just my tears hitting the microphone.
But I really wanted to thank you for being on today and sharing all this, because I have learned so much from doing this project. And it's really given me a different way of thinking of whiskey that is so invaluable now for my experience as a distiller, especially going forward.
Well, thank you, Sid. I mean, you've been such an indelible part of this company in such a short time. Like, we've got some good people lined up to kind of take after you, but it's going to be hard shoes to fill. But I am so proud of you, so happy for you. And I can't wait to see what you make with the big guys.
Yeah.
And then maybe you can convince them to come back, do small experiments here.
Yeah.
I don't know, plenty of chances for collaboration, clearly. So
this is true.
But so proud of you, so happy for you.
Thanks, Riley. Speaking of collaboration, before we head out, craft the perfect blend every time with Techniblend's state-of-the-art blending and batching technology. Gain total visibility into every aspect of your business with Crafted ERP. Country Malt Group offers a carefully curated portfolio of the best ingredients and supplies. And Lotus Beverage Alliance offers one source for all of your craft beverage equipment and supplies. If you've enjoyed this podcast, go to spiritsanddistilling.com and sign up for our free newsletter featuring news stories every week from some of the best writers and distillers in the distilling world. So, Riley, if you want people to learn more about this project or other projects that we're working on or taste it for themselves, how can they dig a bit deeper? Where can they find information about all the fun things that Few is going to be putting out in the next few years?
Yeah, I think follow our Instagram. So Few Spirits, follow our website. I think they're starting to work on some newsletters as well, but Also, if you meet anybody from the team, I mean, we're all incredibly proud of what we're making, and there's a few people that post more than others.
Very true.
But, if you can figure out who works for you and follow them on Instagram, then that's probably your best bet for finding kind of new and unique things. Otherwise, we've got plenty of suppliers around Illinois, throughout the country. And if you want to see us, ask your local retailer.
It's true. They can get us anywhere, Southern Glaciers supplies products. They can get you there as well. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another in-depth distilling conversation for you. Thanks for joining us. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Spirits and Distilling for those who love to make and drink great spirits. Join our free newsletter today at spiritsanddistilling.com for pragmatic, technical, and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Sign up now at spiritsanddistilling.com or click on the link in the show notes.